I think there's a whole generation of people who didn't live through the Cold War who are trying to retcon this to say, well, clearly nuclear weapons are great and they solve all your problems, without realizing that it's been a terrifying 60 and 70 years of people trying not to let this genie out of the bottle.
That's the voice of Tom Nichols, a contributing writer to The Atlantic and the author of its newsletter, Peacefield. He's today's guest on Press the Button, a Plowshares Fund podcast dedicated to nuclear policy and national security. And now here are your co-hosts, Tom Kalina and Lauren Billet.
Thanks, Angela, and welcome back to Press the Button. Lauren, great to see you again. How was your weekend?
Hi, Tom. It's always so great to see you. I love starting my week like this. My weekend was really great. The weather was lovely for the most part, except for a couple hours Saturday afternoon where the sun got the best of me. But it was a beautiful weekend for gardening, which is what my mom, who's in town visiting, did for me. So I have all my favorite flowers planted, some sitting on my desk right next to me. But aside from that, I've just been getting ready for Chain Reaction, our annual gala, which is being held this week on Wednesday, June 8th. And for all of our listeners, you're invited to join us either virtually or in San Francisco for a watch party. You can learn more about either way to join on our website at plowshares.org/chainreaction2022. I hope to see you all there. But we've got a big week ahead of us. Before that, though, Tom, I have to hear about your weekend. What did you get up to?
Well, my weekend was incredibly boring. I spent it recovering from COVID. Yes, I had COVID last week, my first experience with the dreaded virus, but feeling much better now after really taking it easy Saturday and Sunday and just recovering from that, even though the weather was just, as you say, incredible. And I did sneak out into my backyard just to try to experience a little of it while also trying to quarantine. Feeling better now, but again, if you all haven't had COVID yet, you don't want it. So please get vaxxed, get boosted, stay masked. Better safe than sorry.
So glad that you're feeling better, Tom, and happy to have you back with us. And yes, great reminder, get your shot, everybody. But on to your favorite segment, Tom, or at least what I think is your favorite segment, the nuclear news of this week.
Thanks very much, and it is good to be back and feeling better. Nuclear news. Today marks the start of the International Atomic Energy Agency, IAEA, June Board of Governors meeting in Vienna. I know this is not the top of most people's agenda to wake up and learn about the IAEA board meeting. But this meeting is important because it will address both the safety of nuclear power reactors in Ukraine as well as the status of the Iran nuclear deal. So to get into it just a little bit, in his opening statement on Monday, IAEA Director General Rafael Grossi acknowledged that one of the most critical issues the world is facing today is the safety and security of Ukraine's nuclear facilities. And he said that his agency, the IAEA, continues its close collaboration with Ukraine to ensure that Ukraine gets what it needs to efficiently and quickly protect those facilities, and that the agency's goals are to ensure that Ukraine's nuclear facilities are safe, secure, and well protected. And as Grossi said, the urgent need for us to be there is clear to all. Logistics and other such considerations must not prevent it. So we certainly support the agency's efforts to keep reactors in Ukraine safe. Now, switching to Iran, there has been speculation that the Board of Governors might censure or punish Iran during the meeting over its continued failure to cooperate with the agency, and that this could have a negative impact on the stalled talks to get back into the Iran nuclear deal, because then Iran would retaliate in some way to being censured by the IAEA. Grossi stated that the agency has been monitoring Iran based on its nuclear-related commitments under the Iran deal, but as of February 2021, this has become more difficult as Iran has stopped implementing the deal. Grossi stated that Iran has not provided explanations that are technically credible in relation to the agency's findings at 3 undeclared locations in Iran. And as a result, Grossi said that the agency cannot confirm the correctness and completeness of Iran's declarations, which is a pretty straightforward statement in diplomatic speak that he cannot confirm what Iran is saying about its nuclear activities. And as of this recording, we do not know if the agency board meeting will censure Iran or not. The meeting continues through the week. So, Lauren, given all that, what do you have for us on early warning?
This week, I sat down with Kelsey Davenport, the Director for Nonproliferation Policy at the Arms Control Association. We discussed the new reports that indicate that Iran has amassed enough enriched uranium to produce a nuclear weapon for the first time, and what this means for their nuclear program and the ongoing negotiations for the U.S. and Iran to rejoin the 2015 nuclear deal. Kelsey fits in an incredible amount of information into this short segment, so you won't want to miss it.
And then Dr. Emma Belcher, president of Plowshares, sits down with Tom Nichols. He's a contributing writer at The Atlantic and the author of its newsletter, Peacefield. They discuss the outcome of Russian President Vladimir Putin's Victory Day speech and what has changed in the ongoing war in Ukraine, so please stay tuned.
And if you like what you hear, remember to hit subscribe and leave us a rating. Your feedback helps us to improve the show. And with that, let's get into today's episode. The clock is ticking.
And now, early warning, early warning, early warning, early warning. A 7-minute synopsis of this week's nuclear news.
Media coverage of a leaked report by the IAEA indicated that Iran has amassed enough enriched uranium to produce a nuclear weapon for the first time. Iran would still need to enrich the material further to 90% purity, which would take 2 weeks. They would then have to integrate the material into a bomb design and develop a missile to deliver it, which could take a year or more. It's important to note that this process can be reversed if the US and Iran are able to revive the Iran nuclear deal. However, those discussions have been stalled by political issues, most recently the IRGC's designation as a terrorist organization. If the Biden administration wants to limit the political damage of a potential Iranian nuclear bomb, it needs to return the U.S. to the agreement as soon as possible. To help us understand the situation, we are joined by Kelsey Davenport. She is the Director for Nonproliferation Policy of the Arms Control Association. Kelsey, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be back on Press the Button.
It's great to have you back. So, in its reports, the IAEA indicated that Iran possesses enough enriched uranium for the production of a nuclear weapon. What does this mean for their nuclear program?
Well, basically, the IAEA has estimated that Iran has produced enough uranium enriched to 60%, that it could take that stockpile and feed it into its centrifuges, which are the machines that are used to enrich uranium, and produce what's referred to as a significant quantity of weapons-grade uranium, or 25 kilograms of uranium enriched over 90%. And reaching this threshold of 60% is particularly concerning because Iran could move it up to weapons grade so quickly. Essentially, we're in the time frame now where Iran could try to produce the weapons grade material for a bomb in between IAEA inspections. And that's quite concerning because after Iran produces enough fissile material for a bomb, it could move that material to a location to weaponize it. And even though weaponization would take another 1 to 2 years, it would be much more difficult to detect and disrupt this weaponization process. So what the IAEA report is really telling us is that Iran's nuclear trajectory continues to increase the proliferation risk posed by the nuclear program. And if that isn't reversed, if that breakout timeframe isn't increased, it really raises the risk that the United States or Israel might try to take steps to grow that breakout time again. Typically, we've seen acts of sabotage, the assassination of Iranian scientists, the targeting of Iranian nuclear facilities as a means to try to set back the program. But ultimately, all of these steps backfire because Iran ends up hardening its nuclear facilities against further attack, building them deeper and underground, for instance, and ratcheting up their nuclear program in response. In short, these IAEA reports indicate that Iran's nuclear program is at a very risky spot. And if the United States does not take action soon to restore the JCPOA, it's going to significantly increase the risk of conflict.
Thank you so much for that incredible summary of where we're at. So what should we expect at the upcoming IAEA's Board of Governors meeting?
Well, Iran is certainly going to be a contentious topic for the IAEA's board. But that's primarily because of a second report that the IAEA released this past week. And this report provides much more detail about the IAEA's efforts over the past several years to investigate evidence of undeclared nuclear materials and activities. Now, this investigation focuses on activities that took place prior to 2003. So they do not pose, an immediate proliferation risk. And these activities were likely part of Iran's organized nuclear weapons program, which both the United States and the IAEA assessed ended in 2003. But there is clear evidence in this new report that Iran violated its safeguards agreement by failing to declare some of this material to the International Atomic Energy Agency, as it's required to do under its Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty Safeguards Agreement. The IAEA also documents in that report that Iran has still not been forthcoming and provided technically credible answers to the IAEA's test results, which have shown the presence of uranium at 3 other undeclared sites. In the report, Iran says that third-party sabotage could be responsible for the uranium contamination at these facilities. And that explanation really strains credulity. So it's unsurprising that after several years of Iran having stonewalled the IAEA's investigation, and the conclusion that Iran should have declared activities, at one of the 4 sites in question, it's unsurprising that the board, would decide to act, at the upcoming meeting. The United States and its European partners in the JCPOA have already circulated a draft censure resolution that would rebuke Iran for its failure to cooperate and would urge Iran to respond to the IAEA's investigation. Now, the impact that this could have on negotiations to try to restore the JCPOA is unclear at this point. Last fall, President Ibrahim Raisi threatened to further ratchet up Iran's nuclear program if the IAEA board took action against Iran. It's likely that he'll feel similar pressure, if there is a serious move to censure Iran, at the board meeting next week. So I think this could result in an escalatory spiral that makes negotiations to restore the JCPOA more difficult. At the same time, though, the IAEA board really does need to act to censure Iran because there are larger regime safeguards issues at stake here. If the agents, or if the board does not act to support the IAEA's efforts, it sends the wrong message, to other sort of would-be proliferant states about the safeguards regime and the board's willingness to support the mandate of the IAEA. So it's a very fine line to walk in terms of pursuing a censure that supports the agency and demonstrates to Iran that there are consequences for stonewalling, while ideally not, pushing Iran to take such drastic action on its nuclear program that it would have consequences for the negotiations to restore the JCPOA.
As we know, diplomacy is the best option. So what should the Biden administration be doing to ensure that Iran does not get a nuclear weapon?
The only viable option to quickly roll back Iran's nuclear program and restore intrusive monitoring, is to return to full implementation of the 2015 nuclear deal. The proliferation risk posed by Iran's program is so imminent and so urgent at this point. Even negotiating an interim deal or a new agreement would be so time-consuming that we'd be living with a level of significant and intolerable risk. And as I said earlier, that then just increases the likelihood of conflict or military action to try to roll back Iran's program. So, I understand that it's politically difficult to remove the foreign terrorist organization designation on the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. Given the IRGC's activities in the region, their targeting of U.S. troops in the past, their threats to continue doing so, I can see how Biden is loath to take that step because he will face significant political blowback. But that pales in comparison to the cost that Biden will pay if Iran ends up on the verge of a nuclear weapon on his watch. He will pay a far greater political price for being the president that lets Iran get that close to the bomb. So I personally think that if he cannot find the political will to lift the FTO designation on the IRGC, he needs to try to put something else on the table that might entice Iran into concluding a deal to restore the JCPOA. Because at the end of the day, I mean, the JCPOA is the only option we have that restores intrusive monitoring and rolls back Iran's nuclear program to the point where if Iran were to try to dash for a bomb, in the next decade or so, the international community would have time to respond. So the Biden administration has to find a way to close a deal on restoring the JCPOA that benefits U.S. national security, it benefits global nonproliferation priorities, and it benefits the security of our European allies. It's also beneficial to Iran. I mean, if Raisi wants to deliver on his domestic agenda, then the benefits provided by sanctions relief will certainly help doing so. So really, the only option is closing a deal to restore the JCPOA.
Unfortunately, Kelsey, our time is up, but it's been such a pleasure speaking with you. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for having me.
Hi, I'm Jacqueline Shing, the Communications and Marketing Specialist at Plowshares Fund. Russia's invasion of Ukraine has exposed just how close nuclear escalation and nuclear war can be. To meet the urgency of this moment, Plowshares Fund has launched a donation match challenge to make the largest grants possible to those who are working every day to reduce and eliminate nuclear weapons. Right now, all first-time gifts will be matched dollar for dollar, and all new monthly gifts will be matched at their 12-month value. Or increase your giving and the full amount above your last gift will be matched. Go to plowshares.org/donate today. And thanks for listening.
Russian President Vladimir Putin gave his annual Victory Day address on May 9. Many were closely watching to see if this speech would give any hints to Putin's approach and goals in Ukraine, particularly when it came to the nuclear threat. Today, I'm joined by Tom Nichols, contributing writer at The Atlantic and author of its newsletter, Peacefield. Tom is an expert on Russia and nuclear strategy, and we're going to look back at the May 9th speech and discuss what, if anything, is shifting in the third month of the war in Ukraine. Welcome, Tom.
Thanks so much. It's good to see you again.
Likewise. So, Tom, take us back to the beginning of the month. What does Victory Day mark in Russia, and what was the significance of Putin's speech on this day, particularly in the context of the war in Ukraine?
Victory Day in Russia is like the 4th of July and Memorial Day and Veterans Day all rolled into one. It's Victory in Europe Day. It's the defeat of Nazi Germany, a war in which 27 million Soviet citizens perished. And so it is regarded reverentially in Russia, even to this day. And the important point about this year is that we, the kind of Russia watchers and national security folks, wondered if Vladimir Putin would use that day to make a major policy shift about Ukraine. Specifically, I think a lot of us were worried, I know I certainly was, that he might call for a general war against Ukraine instead of this special military operation, which would have been an escalation. I mean, as shocking as it may seem to people, there is still room for Russia to escalate this war even beyond what they're doing, and even without the use of chemical or nuclear weapons. But had he gone that road, I think we were all bracing for greater risk of escalation to unconventional weapons. So that's what May 9th was about. It didn't happen, which is interesting. Instead, Putin gave this kind of downbeat speech where he almost seemed like sullen and grudging. I suspect there are people inside the Kremlin finally, at least getting through to him on some level to let him know how badly this thing is going. I suppose the good sign is that it seemed like there was a little bit more realism there, but we're certainly not out of the woods yet.
Did anything else in particular surprise you in what he said or what he didn't say?
Well, I mean, it was surprising about what he didn't say, in terms of new directions for the war in Ukraine. It was interesting that he kind of went back to the old Soviet tropes. Well, this is NATO and the West is against us and we had to do it because of, NATO plots. I mean, this is all laugh out loud nonsense that even Putin doesn't believe. I doubt anybody in Russia other than the tabloid TV watchers in Russia really believe that. I think what was most interesting, what comes after the May 9th speech, which is that the United States was finally able to make contact with the Russian defense minister and the chief of the Russian general staff. There's been absolute silence on those phone lines for months. It looks like, that the shifting of the war to the Ukrainian east is something that they finally accepted as they're going to be their best hope to get anything done. And I think, in that sense, it may be that, again, some kind of a new realism has been setting in. There was also a critic of the war who appeared on Russian television. Is crazy. If anybody watches Russian television, it's absolutely nuts. It makes even Fox and some American outlets look reasonable by comparison. And yet one of their most well-known shows had this retired colonel who's a well-known defense commentator come on and basically read chapter and verse about why this whole thing was doomed, why it's a total screw up, admitting that, the whole world is against Russia and, we have to comprehend this, why that's bad. Now, what's going on behind the scenes? Like every good Kremlinologist, I don't know. One possibility is that they're starting to let down the public easy. Because, Putin started this war with, we're going to march into Kiev, flowers in the streets, greeted as liberators, new Russian empire, yada, yada, yada. It may now be that they're saying, okay, well, we still believe all that, but maybe we should scale back a bit. It's also possible and it wouldn't be unknown within intra-Kremlin communications that somebody let him go public as a stalking horse for people that are trying to get through to Putin. But on the other hand, it's also not unknown for the Kremlin to deploy critics as a kind of managed dissent to blow off steam. To say, yes, we know, we hear you. Here's a guy, we're letting him go on TV. He's kicking us in the pants. I don't think it's that, if only because about a week later that the same guy had to kind of soft pedal his comments again. I think it was more that somebody high up said, let this guy go on TV and, drop a few truth bombs in the middle of all this, because Russian TV has been literally like, we'll nuke Britain, we'll drop nuclear bombs on Finland and Sweden. At one point, this retired colonel said, we need to stop, waving missiles at Finland and Sweden. That's just silly. So I took these as good signs, but it's hard to talk about good signs when the people of Mariupol and Kherson and other places are getting, bombed into dust.
So speaking of the nuclear aspect, obviously throughout the conflict, Putin has mailed some veiled and some not so veiled, quite overt threats about nuclear use. What are your current concerns when it comes to nuclear escalation?
Well, there's two ways to think about this. The one that a lot of folks have grabbed onto as a form of reassurance is to say, well, he's not going to use nuclear weapons because there's no strategic goal here. There's nothing that it would accomplish. But he may not be thinking that way. He may be thinking in terms of, that a nuclear weapon could kind of sober everybody up and reset the table by exploding one out in the Black Sea or something. Now, I think that's a really low probability thing, especially now. I was a lot more worried about it 2 months ago, especially when it first started to dawn on all of them that they were losing badly. My concern now is still about a mistake, an escalatory black swan event. NATO accidentally shoots down a Russian aircraft. Russian artillery or missiles land in a NATO country, that there's an accident at sea. Who knows? The point about black swan events is that you can't foresee them. And as long as the war is going on, the probability of those gets higher. Now, I know there's been a lot of argument and a lot of debate about not telling the Ukrainians to, go for a ceasefire. But I think it's the Ukrainians as well as everybody else. We all have an interest in seeing Russia defeated in this military adventure, but also we all have to be cognizant that every day the fighting goes on, there is a risk of an escalatory spiral beginning. Now, on the other hand, that's what diplomats and diplomacy and generals and leaders are for, to make sure that doesn't happen while pursuing the aims of state policy. But it's a risk, and I don't think people should just forget about it just because there's all this happy talk about Ukraine winning. I think people need to step back from that. Ukraine is winning by surviving at this point, and that's it. And they have the right to fight for their borders and their country for as long as they want to fight. But the idea that somehow this is now a cakewalk and the Russians are just, one of my colleagues put it, that we can't fall into thinking that the Russians are just hobbits with nuclear weapons, that this is still a formidable force where things could get out of hand.
So, given all of this in this context, what's the future of arms control and avenues for reducing nuclear threat between the US and Russia?
I don't think there's any avenue for any of this as long as Vladimir Putin's in charge. I mean, we are in another Cold War. It's a smaller one, but if you think of a Cold War as two major adversaries contesting large spaces of the world while being held at bay from each other with nuclear weapons, we're here. We've probably been in something like a coldish war with the Chinese, except that we are so integrated with their economy, something that never happened during the first Cold War. But Russia is now isolated. It has been cut off from the international economy. They have wound back the clock on Russian progress at least 15 years in economic and political development. And as long as Putin's in charge, I don't think you're going to get anywhere with that. I think the only way he leaves office is feet first, because he's just decided he's going to rule Russia for as long as he lives. I hope that what comes out of this, God willing that, the peace breaks out at some point, is to say, this is why you do large nuclear reductions and take things off of hair triggers and do de-alerting and all that stuff, because, you don't want to live in a world where one guy like Putin can kind of lose his grip, launch a war, and then everybody's suddenly in this kind of danger. I think one of the smartest and best things that happened was when Russians went to, at least they claimed to go to a heightened alert status at the beginning of the war. And there was this TV footage of Putin saying, I want our troops of the strategic rocket forces to go to special combat duty. And, you could see the defense minister, Shoigu, looking seasick, and Gerasimov sitting next to him, just kind of, staring at the desk. And Biden said, yeah, we're not going to do that. Okay, the Russians are going to Russian. Putin can order what Putin orders. We don't see any immediate threat. I mean, that could have been a moment where a less experienced American president could have made a serious mistake by saying, well, so we're going to DEFCON 3. We're going to put our guys on alert. We're going to start moving bombers around. And then somebody in Russia says, instead, Biden said, yeah, whatever. Okay, Vlad, we understand you had your TV moment. We're not going to respond to that. That was a good move. I mean, we'll know more in the future one day, but I think that probably was a more important move than people realize now.
Speaking of good moves, are there other good moves that the US could make? What lessons do you take from this conflict about US nuclear policy moving forward? You've mentioned a couple of things, but what do you think the US can do that either doesn't rely on Russia right now that would reduce risk, or needs to be preparing for in the future?
Well, I think one thing is that Biden's unwinding this whole stupid plan to somehow renuclearize Europe after Donald Trump pulled out of the INF treaty, which was an incredibly stupid thing to do. Just to be fair, I don't want people to think that this was just Trump. I mean, Trump wouldn't know the INF treaty if he backed over it in a parking lot. He wouldn't know what it was or when it was signed or what it was about. But the problem is he had staffed his administration with people who just hate treaties. John Bolton, all of these kind of hawks who just think that treaties in general restrain American power. And that was stupid. And the plan was to start building small nukes for submarines. Biden has now zeroed that out of the budget. And good. I mean, I think those are good things to do. Nuclearizing Europe was so dangerous that even Ronald Reagan wanted to stop doing it. And I don't think anybody's going to accuse Ronald Reagan of being a weak sister on defense systems. Jimmy Carter started that. Reagan adopted it. Carter didn't want to do it. Reagan certainly wanted to unwind it. And here we are, 35 years later saying, oh, let's do that again. No, that's a really bad idea. So I think keeping nuclear weapons away from, the source of these kinds of conflicts, it has been a good move as well. And, we just need to keep doing that. We need to just keep driving that pressure downward. Unfortunately, there are a lot of Americans who are, how do I put this, Emma, veterans, not of the Cold War, but of the Cold War military industrial complex. And I mean, here's me, old school, Reaganite from the old days talking about this. who think that it's time to build new generations of nuclear weapons and making the argument about how we have to be able to nuke China and Russia at the same time. And I mean, you saw, I think Frank Miller did one of those pieces in the Wall Street Journal, right? I mean, it's like it never ends. It's always the same answer. No matter what the question is, the answer is build more nuclear weapons. If anything, this crisis should have taught us that's a bad idea. People still think that this crisis would have been averted if Ukraine had kept nuclear weapons. I've written about this a couple of times. If anybody wants to find it, it's at the Atlantic. But I think if Ukraine had kept its nuclear weapons, the Russians would have invaded them 15 or 20 years ago. I mean, Yeltsin might have invaded them. You would have had a new government, pretty unstable in those days, and the Russians would have said, okay, we're invading Ukraine for the same reason you Americans are invading Iraq. We're going in. And I think the people who think that somehow nuclear weapons would have guaranteed Ukrainian sovereignty are really fooling themselves. They're really telling themselves a story.
How do you get through to people, or how do we have a proper debate about the reality here?
I think had Ukraine kept its nuclear weapons, there would have been a Central European war about nuclear weapons. And the Americans would have had a much harder time arguing with it. Because I think the Russians would have said, these things are strategic. They're mostly pointed at you. Who knows? There could have been false flag operations or whatever kind of intelligence operations saying, we have evidence of instability in the control of these things. We're going in for the sake of peace of the world. As it is, Putin had to simply say, I'm just an imperialist. I think Ukrainians are Russians and Slavs who belong under Moscow's domination. And I think they're working on nuclear and chemical and biological weapons, which again, it just got laughed out of court, so to speak. But, I think people have this notion that nuclear weapons are magic. That's the problem. If you have nuclear weapons, it solves all your problems. Now, I think you could argue that the old Cold War nuclear equation is holding between Russia and NATO. Russia does not seem to be of a mind to pick a fight with 30 countries and the Americans with a strategic nuclear guarantee. But that hasn't stopped Russia or anybody from other kinds of adventure. Really, didn't stop the Argentines from trying to take the Falklands from Britain. Last I checked, Britain had nuclear submarines. They were there. The whole nuclear balance is an artifact of World War II, if you think about it, right? I mean, we thought we were racing the Nazis, not the Soviets. And then we developed these weapons. World War II ends. We suddenly realized that, we're in this Cold War again that was kind of before 1933. We wouldn't even have relations with the Soviet Union. And now we can't uninvent the technology. I think there's a whole generation of people who didn't live through the Cold War who are trying to retcon this to say, well, clearly nuclear weapons are great and they solve all your problems, without realizing that it's been a terrifying 16, 70 years of people trying not to let this genie out of the bottle. And I think the other thing that I think people listening should understand is how many times we came close. It's easy to sit here in 2022 and say, hey, nuclear weapons, they solved all our problems. Well, except for those many times that they almost ended human existence and that we averted that based on, a lucky call by a Soviet air defense officer or a NORAD officer who figured out 5 minutes before they woke up the president what was going on. And I think it's easy now to look back and say, well, piece of cake, we made it through. Yes, barely.
Well, Tom, thanks so much for spending some time with us. We'll leave it here, but everyone can go and read Tom's work in The Atlantic, and I believe you've got something coming out again really soon. So Thanks for a thought-provoking discussion.
Thanks, Emma.
Thanks for listening to Press the Button. This podcast is produced and edited in Washington, D.C. by Lauren Billet, Angela Kellett, and Alex Hall. Audio engineering in San Francisco by Jacqueline Shing. Our theme song is by Lyric Spawn and Poets of Rhythm, sampled with kind permission. Additional music by San Francisco-based bands 17 Evergreen and the Society of Rockets. To continue the dialogue and support our work, visit plowshares.org.